And that
But if you
fathers,
even look at the textbooks, the technical name for the way childcare workers are taught to work with children is mother care. If
yeah.
you look at the very beginning, father care
Well,
isn't an element of
this
it.
is the point. You see, and you see, if you go into a family court, what you hear all the time is, what are your parenting skills? And by this is meant, can you cook? How many nappies have you changed? Do you read bedtime stories? But these are the very banal and basic functions of parenthood. I mean,
Kind of important too, though.
well, they're important, but there are also functions which are done by babysitters. It can be done by our Latvian nanny just as easily as by either a parent. My point is that what parenting is something much deeper. It has got to do with the kind of the metaphysical. It has its roots in the metaphysical relationship that exists between the parent and the child, and it has got to do not so much with doing things as with being who you are in the presence of the child. And this really I only began to get insight, having written about all this for many years, in a clumsy way, because you start off when when I started this, I was astonished to find that in a so-called civilized democratic society, that there would be this kind of injustice and imbalance, and that nobody would be drawing attention to it. To the extent that when I did so, and I've told this story, I've told this many times, that when I discovered it, having come up through a liberal left model of journalism in which I had been, shoulder to shoulder with feminists and all kinds of liberals as a journalist for an editor for years, my first thought was, God, they're going to be horrified when they hear about this. My friends are going to be, we're going to march on City Hall. And so I ran breathless to tell them about this injustice. What happened? They kicked my head in. They didn't want to hear it.
Didn't want to know.
So there's been a journey for me in this. So I was clumsily trying to describe first, and I started off, I think, rather literally, looking at the law and trying to find what's wrong with the Constitution that this has happened. And it's only partially to do that. It's much more a cultural problem. But this was the point I'm coming to, that only about maybe 10 years ago, after being at it for about 5 years, I read a book called Society Without the Father by a German psychoanalyst, pre-war, post-war, Alexander Mitscherlich. It's a very, very powerful book, but the most powerful thing about it was the introduction by a man called Robert Bly, who was a poet.
I know Robert Bly.
And he wrote about the Great Father. And he said some startling things, really in very brief and terse way. He said, something's happened in the last 30 years that has never happened before. He said, in 6 million years of human evolution, there has been a change in the last 30 years. This is a staggering thought. And he said, what has happened is that the father has been removed from the presence of his children by circumstances beyond his control. And he talked about the Industrial Revolution, that up to that. And he had this beautiful passage, which, I almost remember by heart, but I sort of give an abbreviated version because I find it so moving that it actually nearly makes me break down in tears every time I say it. He said that, the Great Father, what did he do? He fumbled incompetently in full view of his children with nuts and bolts and hammers and saws, leaving spaces between his competences for his children to grow. And as soon as I read that, I said, that's it. That's what fathers do. This is what fathers have done since the beginning of the species. They have been themselves. They have manipulated the world. They have tried to conquer the world in view of their children, so that their children might learn how to do the same thing. And this is what my father did. I mean, then I began to piece together a new map of my own childhood, because I had a certain view of my father, which I picked up from the culture. That he worked, he's a breadwinner. But then I started to see the things he had done for me that I hadn't seen in that way at all. For example, I remember back in the summer when I was about 10 or 11, my father he drove mail cars, which were don't think they have them now, but they're kind of like the equivalent of the stagecoach. He carried mails and newspapers and passengers in this very decrepit van. I did it for a few years myself. So like you would have this van trundling along the countryside, with about a dozen people sitting on mail bags and bales of newspapers and boxes of day-old chicks and talking. And I wrote a book about this experience called Driving at the Crossroads years ago. And but the vans were always on the point of falling apart. They were tied together with rope and wire, and you know, the back doors would be tied to the front, to the dashboard, you know, and I used to have to be, I was riding shotgun for a long time with my father, and I had the screwdriver for opening the passenger door, you know. I had to kind of pick the lock every time we had to let somebody out. And but this, he always had a couple of reserve vans, you know, ready. He'd be working on them because he was a very gifted man. He was a mechanic, he was an engineer, he was all kinds of things, as so many of his generation were. But he decided, he got this van, there was an engine need to be rebored, so he rebored the engine, but he got me to do the valves one summer. So I spent about 6 weeks of a summer holiday for about 6 or 8 hours a day grinding the valves of this engine. And I mean, I don't know, the valve really, it's like a big nail with kind of a grain on the inside of it. It fits into a hole in the block, which has to, and the grooves have to fit exactly if the engine is to run perfectly. And so you have to grind them with paste, with a stick with a suction pad. You don't have to do this, obviously. Now you get a computer to do everything. But and you wear the thing down, so it's like the groove of an old LP. Sure. Slotting into the grooves on the other, on the block. You know, at first I really fought against this because it was so boring. When he would come back at night, and he had this habit of, he had these glasses, but when he wanted to look at anything, he used to put them up on his forehead. So he would just kind of look and say, no, more grinding. And so this went on for weeks. But I became interested in it at the end, in getting the grooves exactly right and seeing the spots of rust or corrosion and removing them, and seeing them disappear. And in the end, my father came one day and said, no, they're okay. So one weekend we assembled the engine and started. It was like a watch. You could barely hear it. And it was absolutely beautiful. And looking back, then I thought, I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back I realized that this episode had taught me so many things.
The rite of passage.
Yeah. About, you know, effort and reward, and you know, what you put in you get out, and application and talent and creativity, all of those things. This is what fathers do. Now imagine going to a courtroom and trying to tell that. I'll tell you, just to give you what you get in a courtroom. I knew a man once who his wife, he was the primary carer for his children, and there were twins, and they had dietary problems, you know, so they had to have special diet. So he took a great interest in this, and he had charts on the wall for the way, you know, for the foods, and trying to get them to eat special foods and so on. And anyway, one day he arrived home, and there was a note on the mantelpiece from his wife saying she'd gone to England, and taking the children, you know, we won't be back. But he went off to England. He searched all of London, and by sheer fluke found them, and took proceedings there to have them brought back under the Hague Convention. So they were returned to Ireland pending, you know, for the hearing. And this man went into court with his charts to explain what he had been doing as a father. And he got to the point where in his evidence where he was saying, he was showing the charts, and this is the, and he said, and then he said, I thought it would be good if they would eat broccoli, because broccoli is, you know, very nutritious, and this is how and the judge interrupted him. He says, broccoli is a horrible vegetable. I'm sending these children back to England. This is the family law system that we have. People don't believe this, but you see, my point is, because it's secret, this seems incredible, but this is the stuff I hear all the time. Because it's secret, this stuff can happen, and there's no accountability.